Most mornings begin the same way. The first light slips quietly across the grass. The air still cool enough to carry the scent of damp earth, and somewhere beyond the fence a blue jay breaks the silence with its sharp, familiar call. A cardinal answers from the cedar branches. Chickadees weave through the maple leaves so lightly they barely seem to disturb them. Everything feels exactly as it did yesterday, and the day before that. You pour your coffee, step onto the porch, and without thinking, your eyes drift toward the trees. It is a routine so ordinary that you hardly notice yourself doing it anymore. But this morning, something refuses to settle. It is not the sky, not yet. The clouds are still scattered across a pale blue horizon. The wind has not picked up. The leaves are almost perfectly still. Even the feeder sways only slightly, as though the morning itself is holding its breath. Then, without warning, the blue jay stops. No frantic flight, no alarm call, just silence. A silence so complete that it seems to spread outward from one branch to the next, until every familiar sound quietly disappears. The cardinal never finishes its song. The sparrows vanish into the shrubs without a flutter. Even the distant chatter that usually blends into the background simply isn't there anymore. You may have experienced this before, most people have. They just rarely remember the exact moment it happened. They only remember the feeling that arrived with it, the quiet certainty that something had changed before they knew what it was. If you're new here, subscribe before you leave, because what you're about to discover may forever change the way you listen to the birds outside your window. And what happened next was even stranger, because that silence was not the beginning of the story. It was the first sign that something had already begun long before you ever noticed it. You stand there for a moment longer than you expected to, holding your coffee in your hand, listening for something that does not come. The morning feels familiar, yet somehow different. Many people know this feeling. It is the quiet moment when a room feels slightly changed after someone leaves, or when you wake up from a dream you cannot remember but somehow still feel. Nothing obvious has happened. There is no clear reason, and yet something inside you notices. Maybe you have looked out your window before and felt that the world was paying attention in a way you could not explain. Maybe you have stepped outside on a morning when the birds were unusually quiet and found yourself looking toward the trees, waiting for the sound to return. Most people brush those moments aside. They tell themselves, it is nothing, just the weather, just coincidence, just a normal change in nature. But the interesting thing about intuition is that it rarely arrives as a loud voice. It usually comes softly, a small feeling, a pause, a moment when your attention suddenly focuses on something you normally would not notice. The blue jay, sitting silently on the branch above the fence, does not look frightened. It simply watches. Its head turns slightly, its feathers moving gently with the breeze, as if it is noticing a world that you cannot fully see. And maybe that is what makes these moments stay with us. Not because we immediately understand them, but because some part of us recognizes them before we have the words to explain why. And as the silence continues across the yard, a deeper question begins to appear. What exactly are the birds noticing before we do? The longer you watch, the more you begin to notice something unusual about the blue jay on the fence post. It is not simply sitting there, it is observing. Its head moves in small, careful turns. One moment it looks toward the trees, the next toward the open space above the yard, then back toward the branches where the other birds have disappeared. To most people, it would look like an ordinary bird pausing between moments. But hidden inside that ordinary moment is a behavior that has been happening for thousands of years, quietly shaping the way birds survive and understand the world around them. Blue jays are known for being highly aware of their surroundings. They remember places. They recognize patterns. They pay attention to changes that many humans walk past without ever noticing. A familiar yard is not just a patch of grass and trees to them. It is a landscape filled with information. The position of the branches, the movement of the leaves, the sounds carried by the wind, the small changes that tell them whether a place feels normal or different. And that is what makes these moments so fascinating. The silence is not empty. It is a form of communication, a pause before action, a moment when the birds are gathering information from a world they experience in a way we rarely see. The blue jay on the fence finally shifts its weight, its feathers catching the soft morning light, but it does not call. It simply waits. And somewhere beneath that quiet behavior is a hidden layer of nature that most people never realize is happening right outside their own window. The blue jay remains on the fence for another few seconds, and the question becomes less about what it is doing and more about how it knows when to do it. For a long time, people believed birds simply reacted to the world around them in simple ways. But researchers have discovered something much more intricate. Birds are constantly collecting information. They notice changes in movement, sound, weather patterns, and the behavior of other animals nearby. Their world is built on tiny signals that most humans never recognize. A blue jay does not need to understand a storm the way we do. It does not need a forecast or a warning on a screen. It simply responds to a collection of small changes happening around it. Scientists who study bird behavior have found that many species use what is called social information. They watch and listen to other birds, learning from the reactions of the entire group. One bird becomes quiet, another notices, and soon the whole area adjusts. It is not panic. It is awareness. It is a living conversation happening through movement, distance, and silence. Standing there on your porch, you are witnessing something that has always been happening just beyond your attention. The birds are not trying to create a mysterious moment. They are simply following instincts shaped over generations. And yet, there is something deeply fascinating about realizing that the same world we walk through every day contains layers of communication we rarely see. The silence was never truly empty. It was information. And the more you pay attention, the more you begin to wonder what else the birds have been noticing all along. You stay on the porch a little longer than usual, even after the first sounds of the morning begin to return. A gentle breeze moves through the branches above you, and the yard slowly starts to breathe again. A few small birds appear near the feeder, landing carefully before taking another quick look around. But your attention keeps returning to the same fence post where the blue jay had been sitting. There is something about that moment that stays with you. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because of how familiar it felt. Many people have experienced moments like this without ever giving them a name. A bird that arrives at the same time each morning. A quiet visitor that seems to know the rhythm of your routine. A small presence that becomes part of the background of your life before you even realize it. Over time, these repeated encounters create something subtle. You begin recognizing the birds, and in a way, they begin becoming part of your world too. The blue jay is no longer just a bird passing through the yard. It becomes the flash of blue above the grass, the sound you hear before stepping outside, the familiar shape resting on the same branch near the window. Scientists understand that birds remember locations and patterns, but there is another layer that feels much more personal. There is comfort in being noticed by another living creature, even one that weighs only a few ounces. And perhaps that is why moments like this stay with us. Because somewhere between observation and emotion, a simple encounter begins to feel like a quiet connection. And as the morning continues, you start wondering if the birds are only responding to the world around them, or if they have also been quietly noticing you all along. As the morning moves forward, the yard slowly returns to the rhythm you know. The leaves begin to stir again. A few distant calls appear between the trees. The world feels ordinary once more, but something about the silence remains with you. You find yourself looking at the branches differently now, noticing small movements you once ignored. A blue jay crossing from one side of the yard to the other. A pause on the old wooden fence. A quick glance toward the open space above the trees before it settles again. These tiny moments seem simple, but together they reveal something much larger. Birds are not experiencing the yard as a quiet place filled with random sounds and movements. They are living inside a constantly changing landscape of signals. Every sound, every shadow, every shift in the air carries meaning. And what feels like a sudden change to us may have been building for several minutes, or even longer, in their world. This is where the connection becomes more interesting. The birds are not only reacting to nature around them, they are part of a larger conversation happening between weather, environment, and every living thing sharing that space. Researchers have spent years studying how birds respond to subtle changes that humans often overlook, from shifts in atmospheric conditions to patterns of movement around their territory. But there is still something deeply fascinating about standing in your own backyard and realizing that an entire world of awareness exists just beyond your normal attention. Because if the birds can notice changes before we do, the next question becomes even more intriguing. What other signals are surrounding us every day that our own senses have learned to ignore? Later that morning, when the sunlight reaches higher into the trees, you find yourself thinking about that quiet moment more than you expected. The yard looks the same. The feeder hangs in the same place. The old fence still carries the marks of years of weather. Yet your attention has changed. You begin to understand that nature has always been speaking in a language that does not use words. Many people believe certain moments in nature feel meaningful because they remind us that we are connected to something larger than ourselves. A bird appearing at the right moment. A sudden stillness before a change in the sky. A feeling that arrives before we know where it came from. Whether those moments are purely biological, deeply personal, or something somewhere between the two, something about them feels difficult to ignore. The blue jay on the fence was not sending a message in the way humans send messages. It was simply following its own instincts, responding to a world filled with signals. But perhaps what stays with us is not only what the bird knew, perhaps it is what the moment awakened inside us. For generations, people have looked to birds as symbols of awareness, transition, and connection. Not because birds are magical creatures, but because they move through a world that often remains hidden from human attention. They notice changes in the wind, the sky, and the landscape long before we stop to look. And maybe that is why a silent yard can feel so powerful. It reminds us that there are always layers of life unfolding around us, quietly waiting to be noticed. And as you glance back toward the fence, you realize the most surprising part was never the silence itself. It was the feeling that something inside you had been listening to. The afternoon settles quietly over the yard, and the feeling of that unusual morning begins to soften into a memory. The blue jay is gone from the fence now, moving somewhere beyond the trees, following a path that only it understands. The branches sway gently above the grass. The feeder moves slightly in the breeze. Life has returned to its familiar rhythm, but you are no longer seeing it in quite the same way. You notice the small things. The way sunlight rests on the leaves. The sound of a distant bird calling from somewhere beyond the backyard. The few seconds of stillness between one sound and the next. It is easy to overlook moments like these because they do not demand our attention. They arrive quietly and leave quietly. But sometimes the smallest moments are the ones that stay with us the longest. Maybe that is because they remind us that the world around us is far more aware than we often realize. The birds continue their routines. The trees continue to move with the seasons. The sky continues changing above the same place you have stood many times before. And somewhere between science and personal experience, there is a space where wonder exists. A place where we can appreciate what we understand while still leaving room for what we do not. The blue jay was simply being a blue jay. But the moment it created gave you something more valuable than an answer. It gave you a reason to slow down, to look closer, to listen. And as the day begins to fade into evening light, you find yourself wondering if maybe the world has been quietly speaking all along, and all we needed was a moment of silence to finally hear it. The evening arrives slowly, painting the edges of the yard with soft golden light. The fence where the blue jay once rested is quiet now, but the memory of that morning remains. You still look toward that branch sometimes, not because you expect an answer, but because certain moments leave behind a feeling that is difficult to explain. The world has returned to its normal rhythm. The birds sing, the wind moves through the trees. The same backyard that felt so strangely still now feels alive again. But something inside you has changed. You have started noticing what was always there. The small pauses between sounds, the movement of wings above the grass, the way nature communicates without needing words. Maybe the blue jay was only responding to changes in the air. Maybe it was simply following instincts shaped by countless generations. But maybe the deeper meaning was never only about what the bird knew. Maybe it was about what the moment allowed you to remember. That you are still connected to the living world around you. That your own intuition, that quiet feeling beneath your thoughts, may notice more than you realize. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you enjoy moments like this, consider subscribing before you leave, because there are still countless quiet mysteries in nature that most of us pass by without ever truly seeing. And somewhere beyond this backyard, beneath another evening sky, a blue jay may be sitting on a distant branch, watching the world change around it. Maybe it was only a bird, but somehow it never felt like only a bird.